In the wild, unforgiving desert of 1890s Nevada, a promise was made, a promise of land, of prosperity, of new beginnings. The Robertsons, a family with a reputation for their charismatic words and a deep connection to the rugged wilderness, spoke of a land so fertile, so full of life, it could make any man rich and any family secure. The opportunity seemed too good to pass up for those brave enough to trust in the words of Jedediah Robertson. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly known, was that their journey into the wilds of Las Vegas would be their last. They had no idea the land they were promised would become their grave, a cursed plot where their dreams would be shattered and their lives stolen. The settlers began their journey full of hope, leaving their homes behind, packing their bags and dreams of a future in the promised land of Nevada. The Robertsons had sold them on the idea of a new world, untouched by time, where riches flowed freely and peace was just beyond the horizon. What they didn't know was that the desert held something darker than any storm, an ancient curse lying dormant for centuries waiting to be disturbed. Upon arrival, the settlers were greeted by dust, barren land, and a sense of foreboding that swept through their hearts like the desert winds. There were no lush fields, no fresh water bubbling from streams as promised. Instead, the earth cracked underfoot and the sun seemed to beat down relentlessly, a constant reminder that something was wrong. Yet they stayed. They had to, no turning back. The Robertsons, with their unshaken confidence, assured them it was only a matter of time before the land awakened, that this was just a brief trial they needed to endure. But the promise of a new life soon turned into something far worse than they could have imagined. As the days stretched on, sickness spread like wildfire through the settlers. First it was fever, then insomnia, then death. Strange shadows moved at night, figures no one could explain. The land itself seemed to hum, a sickening vibration beneath their feet. Desperation took hold, and when the first man died, the settlers began to question, had they been lured here by the promise of wealth, or was this place truly haunted, cursed by forces unknown? The mystery deepened when 74 souls paid the price for their belief in Jedediah Robertson's promise. 74 souls lost to the desert, to mystery, and to a land that seemed to have its own sinister intention. The tale of the Robertsons' land became one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the American frontier, with no answers, just a trail of death and disappearance. And the question that still echoes: what happened to the settlers of Robertson's land? Before we uncover the chilling truth behind the Robertsons' cursed land, make sure to hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and give us a thumbs up if you're intrigued by the mystery. Do you think the 74 settlers were simply victims of bad fortune, or was there something darker at play? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your theories and opinions matter to us. If you're a fan of historical mysteries, haunted lands, and tales of unsolved horror, you're in the right place. Join our community as we explore this spine-tingling story together. It was a land that promised everything: hope, freedom, and the lure of a new beginning. The year was 1890. And in the rugged wilderness surrounding Las Vegas, Nevada, a new settlement was born, the Robertsons' land. But what was meant to be a utopia for those brave enough to trust its promise would soon become the stuff of nightmares. The story began with a man named Jedediah Robertson, a charismatic frontiersman with a vision. He had seen the promise of the American frontier before. He had worked the land, battled through the harsh winters, and witnessed the rise and fall of countless settlements. But for Robertson, this was more than a mere dream. It was his destiny. Jedediah spoke of the land near Las Vegas as if it were a treasure: fertile soil, abundant water, and a bright future. It was a place untouched by the ravages of time. He promised that for the right price anyone willing to risk their future would find prosperity beyond measure. The settlers, eager to escape the hardships of their current lives, were drawn to his words. Many had nothing left to lose. They left their homes, packed their belongings, and set off for the promised land that Robertson so passionately spoke of. At first it was a quiet journey. No one questioned Robertson's charismatic assurances. The settlers were used to tough conditions. They were pioneers after all. But as they crossed into the wild stretches of desert, something began to change. The land seemed to stretch on forever, an endless sea of dust and dry earth. The horizon appeared distant, almost unreachable, and when the settlers arrived at the designated spot, the plot of land that Jedediah had promised them, it was far from the lush valley they had imagined. Instead, the land seemed to wilt under their feet. There were no lush rivers, no green meadows, only a desolate wasteland. The dry desert stretched endlessly before them, nothing but sand and cracked earth. Hope slowly began to evaporate. But Jedediah's confidence never wavered. It's just a matter of faith, he told them. The land needs time to awaken. Trust me. But even Jedediah couldn't explain the strange chill that had settled over the settlement. At night, as the wind howled through the sparse trees, the settlers whispered of strange sounds, echoes in the dark, like footsteps just out of reach. And there were other whispers too. Some said the land had been cursed, that the desert had swallowed the souls of those who had come before. But Jedediah would have none of it. There's no such thing as curses, he said, his voice unshaken. This is the land of opportunity, and we're going to make it work. Still the land resisted. The settlers began to fall ill, one by one. First it was fever, sweats, and chills that wouldn't let go. Then the livestock began to die. Cattle that had been thriving on the trip to the settlement now dropped dead with no warning. The water from the nearby well began to taste bitter, as though it had been poisoned. Desperation took root in the hearts of the settlers as they realized they were trapped in a barren land, with no way to sustain themselves. Jedediah's calm demeanor became more erratic. As the days went on, he spoke of the land awakening, but there was no awakening to be seen. Instead, an ominous presence seemed to be growing around them. Some claimed they saw shadows in the distance, flickering like flames that vanished when they looked again. Voices were heard, but no one was there to speak. A sickly fog sometimes rolled in at night, suffocating the air, making it hard to breathe. There was a heavy sense of something watching, something that hung over the settlement, like a cloud. And then the dreams began. It started with just a few settlers, whispers of bad dreams, terrible visions of figures in the darkness. But soon it spread like wildfire. Almost everyone had them, vivid, haunting dreams of figures moving through the night, of dark shapes with hollow eyes that came for them while they slept. And the worst part, they woke up tired, as though they hadn't slept at all. No one dared speak of the haunting visions, but their presence could be felt in the air. Jedediah tried to maintain his optimism, but even he couldn't ignore the change that had settled over the settlement. The once bustling camp became more like a ghost town, filled with vacant-eyed men and women, their faces gaunt with hunger and despair. It was during this time that the first death occurred. The name of the first victim was Eli Peters, a strong young man who had arrived with his wife and 2 children. He was known for his enthusiasm and hard work, but after just a few weeks in the settlement, he fell ill with a fever that no one could explain. Within 3 days, Eli was dead, his body stiff and cold as though the life had been sucked from him. Some said it was the fever, others whispered that it was the land itself that had taken him, but the truth was far more sinister than anyone could comprehend. Then came the second death, and the third. It wasn't long before the whispers turned to outright panic. The settlers began to speak openly about their fear, the fear that something dark was at work in the land they had come to claim. They spoke of voices in the wind, of eyes in the dark, and of shadows that moved where no shadows should be. But the real horror wasn't in the voices, nor in the figures that haunted their dream. The real horror was the dread that seemed to creep deeper with each passing day, infecting every man and woman in that cursed settlement. As the days turned into weeks, 74 men, women, and children would pay the price for their trust in Jedediah's promises. Their lives, taken by something they couldn't understand, were absorbed by the land, the settlement, now a forgotten place, buried beneath snow and time. But there were no answers, no closure, only the promise of land, a land that would not give back what had been taken from it. And with that, the Robertsons' land faded into history, a cursed, forgotten plot of earth, where the whispers of the past remain, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough to uncover its secret. It all began with a promise, a dream built on words alone. In the early months of 1890, a man named Jedediah Robertson arrived in the bustling town of Las Vegas, Nevada, bringing with him a vision that would change the lives of countless men and women. He was a man of vision, known for his booming voice and the way he spoke about the frontier with a certain kind of reverence, like a preacher speaking of salvation. Land of opportunity, he would say to anyone who'd listen. A land untouched, fertile, abundant, a place where men like you and me can rise above, build legacies, and make something of ourselves. The West is open, and it's ready to be tamed, waiting for those bold enough to stake a claim. At first it was nothing more than talk, a rumor, until he took action. Jedediah Robertson wasn't just a dreamer, he was a man of action. He had long been successful in various business ventures, but this was something else. His latest adventure was something that promised wealth beyond imagination, an area just outside of Las Vegas, where no one had dared settle. This was his chance to carve out something greater than any man before him. He wanted to create a self-sustaining community, a land where hard work would translate directly into prosperity. The land of the future, he called it. Word spread quickly across the region. People who had spent years working hard just to make ends meet, farmers, ranchers, miners, and even a few who had lost everything during the Panic of 1893, found hope in Jedediah's work. He spoke of fields rich with crops that could be grown for trade, of water that could be tapped beneath the earth, and of the perfect location for both trade routes and self-sufficiency. To these weary souls, his promises were like a lifeline, a way to escape their past misfortunes and begin again. The advertisements spread like wildfire across nearby states, attracting dozens, then hundreds of settlers. Newspapers ran stories about the great promise of the Robertsons' land. People were desperate, yes, but more than that. They were hungry for something to believe in, something that could give them a chance at a new life. When Jedediah Robertson began selling plots, he was swamped with eager buyers, all ready to take a chance on the life he promised. All they had to do was make the journey, arrive at the land, and set to work. The rest would fall into place. Soon a caravan of families, farmers, and individuals set out. They packed up their belongings, their hopes and dreams, and they followed Jedediah's carefully drawn maps, heading outward, a journey of faith, a leap into the unknown. The journey was treacherous, especially in winter when the roads were rugged and snow-capped peaks seemed to block the way, but each person was driven by the same hope, that the promised land would deliver them from the harshness of life they had come from. For weeks, They traveled across the barren deserts and rugged hills. Along the way, many of the settlers became restless, unsure if this venture would lead to the riches they had been promised. They encountered harsh conditions, storms, food shortages, and worst of all, the silence of the desert. But Jedediah's confidence never wavered. He assured them that they were close, that the land they sought was just ahead. And then in the spring of 8, at first it was beautiful. The air was still and crisp, and the morning sun cast a golden light over the land. There was a sense of awe as the settlers looked out over the wide expanse, the promise of an untouched land waiting for them to shape. The hills seemed to roll gently into the horizon, the earth seemingly ready to accept their work. The first few days were filled with excitement as the settlers marked off their plots, staked claims, and began preparing to build homes and farms. Jedediah, the charismatic leader, rallied them all. "This is it," he would say, standing tall at the top of a small hill overlooking the land. "This is what we've worked for. This land will feed us, shelter us, and lead us to a future we couldn't have dreamed of back east. Look at this, men. This is our chance." He was right about one thing. The settlers were working tirelessly. They cleared the land, dug wells, and began laying the foundations for the homes that would stand for generations. The soil, although rocky in some areas, seemed fertile, and the first crops, corn, wheat, and potatoes, began to grow with unexpected abundance. The settlers were encouraged, even hopeful. Jedediah had promised them a paradise, and for a while it seemed to live up to his word. However, the honeymoon period was brief. As the days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen. No one wanted to speak of it aloud, but the unease began to spread among the settlers. By the end of the first month, rumors started to circulate that the water from the newly dug well tasted strange, almost bitter. Others complained of headaches and nausea after drinking it. No one could explain it, but those symptoms were just the beginning. Jedediah, always optimistic, brushed aside their concerns. "You've been working too hard," he told them. "You're just tired from the journey. Rest, and you'll see the land's true potential." But when the first death occurred, the whispers grew louder. A young man by the name of Eli Hawkins, a farmer from Utah, was found dead in his small cabin. No one knew how it happened. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious injuries. He had simply been found lying in his bed, his face contorted in a horrible expression of terror. At first people thought it might have been a natural cause, perhaps illness, or even the stress of the journey. But as the weeks passed, more settlers began to fall ill. The deaths didn't stop there. One after another, the settlers began to succumb to mysterious ailments. Weakness, fatigue, and an eerie pallor overtook them. Their dreams became plagued by dark visions, nightmares of dark figures, moving silently through the sand. The winds would howl through the barren land at night, a low, ghostly wail, as if the land itself was calling to them. By the end of the second month, there was no longer any denying it. The land, which had promised so much, was beginning to take its toll. Jedediah, once the figure of strength and conviction, began to show cracks in his resolve. He was no longer the charismatic leader who had promised them a bright future. The dream of the promised land began to fade, and the settlers were left to wonder, was this land truly cursed? Had they been misled into the hands of something far darker than they could have ever imagined? The promise of prosperity had slowly turned into a living nightmare. The early days on the land had been filled with hope, but that hope began to decay quickly, like the rotting leaves of an autumn tree, swept away by the wind. What was promised to be fertile, life-giving land had begun to reveal its dark side, and those who had come seeking a fresh start soon found themselves trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. It wasn't long before the settlers began to realize the full extent of their peril. It started subtly: an extra hour of fatigue here, a subtle headache there. But by the third month, The symptoms began to pile up. The land sickness wasn't just in the water. It wasn't just in the air. It seemed to seep from the very soil itself, an invisible blight creeping over everything. The crops withered despite their best efforts, and the once rich soil became barren. What should have been a season of bounty turned into a season of death. But it was not just the land that was conspiring against them. There was something else, something unseen, a force beyond the realm of understanding. The settlers began to hear things, soft whispers in the wind, faint voices that called them from beyond the walls of their homes. No one could explain it, but it was impossible to ignore. At night, the wind would howl. But it wasn't just wind. It was something else. The very earth seemed to vibrate beneath them. And then came the first murder. It was Jacob Montgomery, a burly, quiet man who had never made much of an impression. He had kept to himself, living with his wife and children in a small cabin on the outskirts of the settlement. One evening he was found dead. His throat had been slashed with such precision that the local doctor couldn't believe it. It wasn't a mere accident. This was no random attack. The cut was clean, deliberate, surgical in nature. And the strange thing was, there was no sign of a struggle. His family, his wife and children were nowhere to be found. Jedediah, always the optimist, tried to explain it away. Perhaps it was some wild animal, he said, maybe a rogue wolf from the mountains. But there were no tracks, no signs of an animal. Jacob Montgomery's death wasn't an accident. It was murder. And what was even more unsettling, there were no suspects, no leads, just a mystery that seemed to grow more sinister with each passing day. The settlers tried to continue working, despite the fear that began to gnaw at their hearts. But the atmosphere at the camp had changed. People no longer worked together with the same enthusiasm. They kept their heads down, their eyes darting nervously as they passed each other in the street. No one spoke openly of it, but everyone knew that something was terribly wrong. The strange deaths didn't stop there. One by one, people began to vanish. Mary Saunders, a young woman who had come with her fiancé, disappeared without a trace. The couple had been inseparable, their love strong. And yet one morning, she was gone. The fiancé, Henry Cartwright, searched the settlement for her, but he never found her. His search ended when he was found dead, his body near the well, his hands clawing at the earth as if trying to dig something out. The stories, the rumors, the whispers became harder to ignore. Some said the land had taken the settler. Others said it was the ghosts of the past, the spirits of those who had perished in the desert long before anyone had come to claim the land. But no one knew the truth, not the settlers, not Jedediah, and certainly not anyone who had ventured too deep into the mystery of the Robertsons' land. And as the weeks passed, the disappearances only worsened. It wasn't just the adults, children were taken too. The youngest of them, Emily Larson, a 5-year-old girl who had been playing with her dolls in the dirt, simply vanished. Her parents searched the land, screamed for her, but there was no trace. It was as though she had been swallowed by the very earth. Each disappearance was more terrifying than the last. There was no pattern, no explanation, just the inexplicable loss of one person after another. And as the bodies started piling up, some found in the woods, others hiding in their cabins too afraid to venture outside, the settlers began to realize something they could no longer deny. This was no ordinary tragedy. Something was stalking them, something that was beyond their understanding, beyond any earthly explanation. Jedediah, once the confident leader, began to unravel, his carefully constructed facade cracked, and the cracks deepened into something darker. His face, once bright and full of hope, became drawn, weary and full of guilt. The dream he had sold to the settlers was crumbling, and with it so was his mind. He wandered the settlement at night, speaking to no one, muttering about sacrifices and the price of ambition, but his ramblings made no sense to anyone. He no longer had the answers they needed. By the time spring arrived, the land was no longer just barren. It was cursed. The air smelled of decay, the water tasted foul, and the land itself seemed to reject the settlers' attempts to make it their home. The crops that had once been the promise of prosperity were now twisted, warped as though the land had somehow taken on a life of its own. And with that, the final death toll was counted. 74 settlers had been claimed, each one lost to something far more dangerous than just the land. And so the Robertsons' land became a forgotten place, a cursed, dead patch of earth, where dreams had been turned into dust. Some say the ghosts of those who perished still roam the grounds, still searching for answers that will never come. Others claim that Jedediah, broken and desperate, wandered the land for the rest of his life, haunted by the price his family had paid for a dream that would never come true. No one would ever know the full extent of the tragedy. The mystery of the Robertsons' land and the 74 souls who paid the price would live on only in whispers, only in the dark corners of forgotten. The land itself had taken them, leaving only questions that would never be answered. As the death toll rose and the land grew more desolate with each passing day, the price the settlers had paid for Jedediah Robertson's promises became impossible to ignore. What began as a hopeful venture, fueled by dreams of prosperity and self-sufficiency, had turned into a macabre tale, one that would be whispered about for decades to come. A tale of betrayal, sacrifice, and the cost of ambition. In the early days of the settlement, the Robertsons had promised opportunity, a fresh start for those brave enough to follow them into the harsh deserts of Nevada. That the promises they made had been nothing more than a veil, hiding the terrible truth of what had been buried beneath the land. The settlers, eager to escape the hardships of their old lives, had been drawn to the mystical allure of Jedediah's vision, but the reality they faced was far darker than they could have ever imagined. By the time the fourth death occurred, the settlers were beginning to understand the grim nature of the situation. A man named Edgar Pierce, a quiet carpenter who had been one of the first to arrive, was found dead at his workbench, his body unnaturally stiff, his eyes wide in terror. But it wasn't the manner of his death that horrified the others. It was the expression on his face, a look of horror so intense that no one could shake the image from their minds. Some say Edgar had seen something, a shadow in the corner of his vision that no one else had noticed. Others claimed he had tried to flee, to escape the suffocating grip of the land, but his heart had given out from the sheer terror of what was happening around him. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that Edgar Pierce's death marked a turning point in the settlement. The whispers of curses and supernatural forces grew louder, but no one dared speak too openly about what they feared. With each death, the grip of fear tightened around the settlers. The once thriving community became a place of suspicion and paranoia, with everyone watching each other, unsure who would be the next victim. Jedediah Robertson, the man who had promised them life, now seemed to have been swallowed by the very darkness they had all entered into. He no longer appeared to be the confident, charismatic leader who had set them on this journey. His mind, once sharp and focused, had deteriorated into something unrecognizable. The land had taken him to. It was said that Jedediah wandered the settlement at night, speaking in strange tongues, muttering about things no one could understand. He became a ghost of the man he once was, and the settlers began to question if he was somehow connected to the curse that had claimed so many of them. Was it his fault? Had the land somehow claimed him too? But there was no time for answers. The deaths were mounting, and with each new loss, the remaining settlers grew more desperate. Families were torn apart as their loved ones succumbed to illness, accidents, or the fateful hand of death. The settlers no longer cared about the land, the crops, or the homes they had built. They wanted out, but the desert with its empty sky and barren earth held them captive. There was no escaping what had been unleashed. It was Sarah Bennett, a woman who had arrived with her husband and 3 children, who provided the final piece of the puzzle. Sarah, like many others, had watched her family slowly wither away, each of them falling ill in turn. But Sarah had witnessed something that no one else had. One night when the wind was particularly fierce, she had gone to check on her children in their cabin. As she entered the room, she saw her youngest son, Thomas, standing by the window, his face pressed against the glass, staring out into the night. "What's wrong, Thomas?" Sarah had asked, but the boy did not answer. His eyes were wide and vacant, his body rigid as he stared into the dark expanse outside. When Sarah tried to pull him away from the window, he resisted. "I hear them," he whispered. "They're calling to me. They want me to come." Sarah had grabbed her son, pulling him away from the window and shutting the door. But it was too late. Thomas had changed. He had become like the others, his mind lost to something that Sarah could not understand. From that night on, Thomas would speak of figures in the night, of whispers from the darkness that no one else could hear. But even more chilling were the stories he would tell. He spoke of ancient beings, of those who had walked the land long before the settlers ever arrived. He spoke of a ritual, a sacrifice that had been demanded in exchange for prosperity. The settlers began to realize the full weight of their mistake. The land had not been blessed. It had been cursed. The strange deaths, the whispered voices, the fever that spread like wildfire. These were not just random acts of nature. They were the consequences of a deal made long ago, a pact that had been sealed with blood, and now the settlers were paying the price. Jedediah Robertson, in his madness, had been unable to escape the truth. He had led them into the clutches of a curse, one that was tied to the ancient rituals of the land. But what was worse, he had allowed it. As the leader, he had brought them to this cursed place. And now, just like the others, he too was a prisoner of the land. The land demanded payment, and it had been paid. 74 lives had been claimed, each one a sacrifice to the spirit of the land. By the time the final deaths came, the remaining settlers were no longer capable of resisting. They had seen too much, lost too much, to deny the truth any longer. The land that had promised them opportunity had only offered them death. The Robertsons had sold them a lie, and the price had been steep, too steep. In the end, the settlement was abandoned, the land left to wither as it always had. No one dared return, and the Robertsons' land faded into obscurity, buried beneath layers of time, history, and forgotten memory. But even today, the whispers of what happened there remain carried on the wind, across the barren desert, and through the forgotten pages of history. The price had been paid, and no one would ever know if the land would ever be free of the curse it had spawned. The tragedy of the 74 settlers left in its wake more than just empty homes and unplanted fields. The mystery of what happened at Robertson's land festered in the shadows, drawing the curious, the skeptical, and the determined. News of the horrific events spread across Nevada, across the United States, and even overseas, with many calling it the most shocking and inexplicable disaster to have struck the western frontier. But what had truly happened to the settlers? What had led to such a devastating loss of life, and who, or what, was responsible? It didn't take long for local authorities and investigators to take an interest in the Robertsons' land. A few months after the last of the settlers had been buried or disappeared, A team of officials was dispatched to Las Vegas to investigate the events surrounding the deaths. Led by Sheriff William Calloway, the investigation would dig into the rumors and superstitions that had taken root in the minds of the villagers, and try to uncover the truth buried beneath a mountain of fear. Upon arriving, Sheriff Calloway was struck by the eerily quiet nature of the land. It was almost as if the earth itself had absorbed the tragedy, leaving no trace of the once thriving settlement. The cabins had fallen into ruin, the dirt roads cracked and scattered with overgrown weeds. The first thing the sheriff noticed was the atmosphere, heavy, still, as if the land itself was watching. Something felt wrong from the moment he stepped onto the property. Calloway and his team made their way through the abandoned settlement, inspecting the buildings, searching for any sign of the settlers' final days. What they found, however, only deepened the mystery. The homes, though abandoned, still contained the remnants of life. Half-eaten meals sat cold on tables, torn clothing lay in disarray, as if left in a hurry. But what really disturbed the investigators was the strange carvings found on the walls of several homes, symbols that no one could recognize. They resembled ancient runes, similar to those associated with old pagan rituals. Was this evidence of some occult practice, something that had twisted the settlers' minds into madness? For days, Sheriff Calloway combed through the site with his team, trying to piece together the event, but every lead seemed to end in dead ends, every theory more absurd than the last. One theory that gained traction was that the settlers had been driven to paranoia and insanity due to the harsh conditions of the land. The desert, it was said, had a way of playing tricks on the mind. Heat strokes, dehydration, and the loneliness of the frontier could easily push even the strongest men to their limits. Perhaps the settlers had turned on each other in a fit of desperation. But as the investigation continued, a darker theory began to take hold. What if the settlers hadn't just succumbed to natural causes, or insanity? What if they had been the victims of something far more sinister? Something unnatural, something preternatural that the land had called upon. It was impossible to ignore the strange occurrences reported by survivors, the nightmares, the whispers in the dark, the figures seen moving in the shadows. Could it be that Elias Robertson, knowingly or unknowingly, had led his settlers into the embrace of an ancient curse? One survivor, a man by the name of Oliver Trent, had returned to Las Vegas months after the incident, haunted and broken. His account was chilling. Trent had been one of the few who had managed to escape before the final wave of death. He spoke of the land as if it had a will of its own, something alive, something that had called to them, seduced them, and then consumed them. It was like the earth itself was angry, Trent said, his eyes distant. At night we heard things, voices, whispers, like the wind was trying to tell us something, but it was always just out of reach, and sometimes in the dead of night. I swear I saw shadows moving. They weren't shadows that belonged to people. They were something else, something that wasn't supposed to be there. According to Trent, the settlers began to speak of rituals, of ancient pacts, of things that had been buried for centuries beneath the earth. They had come to claim. He described seeing Elias Robertson grow more and more withdrawn, as if the land itself had a hold on him. Robertson's sanity began to unravel, just like the rest of the settlers. The man who had promised a new beginning was becoming a hollow shell of his former self. Some said that Robertson had known all along, that he had heard of the ancient curse that bound the land, but had ignored it in his ambition to carve out a new life for himself and his family. Others believed he had discovered something terrible, an ancient artifact, hidden beneath the land, tied to the old pagan rituals of the area. Sheriff Calloway, however, found no such artifacts. There was no sign of anything unnatural, no ancient relics, no evidence of occult practices, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed, that there was a truth just beyond his reach. Was it possible that the land itself had turned against them, that it had been waiting for the right moment to claim the settlers, to draw them into its dark embrace? The investigation eventually turned to the possibility of disease. Could an unknown bacterial infection, carried by the water, have caused the strange symptoms and deaths? After all, many of the settlers had complained of illness, fevers, chills, and headaches before they died. However, autopsies performed on the bodies found no signs of infection, no signs of poisoning or pathogens. Whatever had caused the deaths, it wasn't something easily explained by modern medicine. As the investigation continued, some began to believe the supernatural theories more than they believed the medical or psychological ones. Many began to ask if the land itself had some kind of dark power, perhaps bound by old rituals that even the settlers couldn't comprehend. Could it be that the land had been waiting for a new generation to come, so that it could claim them as it had done so many years before? The mystery deepened with each passing day. Sheriff Calloway was no closer to the truth than he had been when he first arrived. He had no concrete answers, only a growing sense of dread. The whispers of curses, rituals, and revenge from the earth only seemed to grow louder, more real, and yet no one had seen anything. No one had witnessed the forces that could have caused such a horrific tragedy. The final conclusion of the investigation was left unresolved. The authorities had no answers for the families who had lost loved ones, no answers for those who were left behind to wonder if their deaths had been part of some ancient plan. Theories were left to mutter in the wind, to fade into time, just like the Robertsons' land, a forgotten place, shrouded in mystery. What happened at Robertson's land? Was it the curse that killed the settlers, or was it simply the desperation of men, driven by their own fear? The answers remain lost, buried beneath the bitter winds of the desert. But one thing is certain: the land had claimed its pride. As the tragedy surrounding the 74 deaths on Robertson's land began to seep into public consciousness, it wasn't just the official investigation that garnered attention. It was the stories, the testimonies of those who had been closest to the disaster, the survivors, the witnesses, the people who had seen things in the eerie desert night that no one dared speak of openly. Their accounts would paint a chilling picture of what truly transpired on that forsaken plot of land. The first to speak out was Eleanor Carter, a woman who had arrived with her husband and 2 children. Eleanor's testimony was one of the most vivid and one of the most disturbing. When asked about her memories of the settlement, she spoke in a calm voice, but her eyes betrayed the deep horror she had witnessed. "We were promised something different," Eleanor began. "When we arrived, the land seemed, well, it seemed like it could be something. We worked hard. We put down roots. My husband was the first to fall ill, just 2 weeks in, feverish. But it wasn't just sickness. There was something in the air. A weight. The air felt thick, as if the land itself was heavy with secret." She paused, her hands trembling as she recalled what had happened next. "One night I went looking for him. I heard strange noises in the night. Voices, whispers in the wind. The others didn't hear it. I'm sure of it. I was the only one who noticed. I went out to the well, and when I reached it, I found my husband standing there staring into the distance. He wasn't himself. He didn't look like the man I married. His eyes were hollow, empty." Eleanor described how her husband had whispered to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're waiting," she recalled him saying. "They want me to stay. The land, it calls." The last words he ever spoke. By morning he was gone, vanished without a trace. No one could explain it, but the look in his eyes, I knew something had taken him. Eleanor's account was one of the first to suggest that something more sinister was at play, something supernatural. But it wasn't just her. Another survivor, Daniel Montgomery, the brother of the first man to be murdered, spoke of strange occurrences he had witnessed during his brief time at the settlement. Unlike Eleanor, Daniel's testimony was filled with fear and anger. He had witnessed firsthand the descent into madness that had overtaken many of the settlers. They called it madness, but I knew it was something else. Daniel said, his voice low, "When Jacob died, my brother, the first to be killed, it wasn't just a death. It was a ritual, I swear it. People started to act strange afterward. They'd stare at the land, whispering to themselves like they were trying to hear something we couldn't hear. It was like the land was feeding on them." Daniel's voice broke as he continued, describing how the settlers began to fear the dark. You could see the fear in their eyes. It wasn't like any illness I've seen. It wasn't fever or sickness. It was something that came from within, and it spread like wildfire. People would speak in strange languages no one could understand. At first we thought it was just a coincidence, but then it happened more often. We'd find people staring into the night, not responding to us. But it wasn't just the settlers who had witnessed the strange behavior. Tom Bennett, a nearby farmer who had witnessed the settlement's rise and fall from a distance, spoke of something far darker. Tom had been one of the first to find the bodies of those who had died, and his testimony offered an even more chilling theory. I had been working on my farm one morning when I noticed smoke rising from the west, Tom recalled. At first I thought it was just a fire, a typical prairie fire, but when I got closer I saw that it wasn't smoke. It was something else. It was like the land itself was burning. The ground was black, as if it had been scorched, but there was no flame, and it was unlike anything I've ever smelled. Rotting flesh mixed with burning herbs. Tom's account was one of the most disturbing, for what he discovered in the ruins of the settlement was far worse than he could have imagined. The bodies, they were arranged, almost like a sacrifice. I've seen skulls arranged in patterns, bodies with no eyes, and the same runes we'd seen on the walls of the cabins. It was like a ritual, one that had gone horribly wrong. I don't know how, but I know that land took them, took their soul. Tom's testimony was corroborated by Hannah West, the widow of one of the last settlers to die. She had found the bodies of her husband and son, their limbs twisted in unnatural angles. She spoke of the same eerie silence that had hung over the settlement, how it was as if the earth itself had swallowed the cries of the dead. The land wanted them. She said, her voice choked with emotion. It didn't care who they were. It just took first my husband, then my boy, and when I went to bury them, it was like the earth wouldn't let me. I had to fight the land itself to bury them. I swear to you, it was like the ground fought back. Father Richard Harper, a priest who had been called to the settlement to offer last rites, described a vivid encounter with something that could only be described as demonic. I have seen the devil in many forms, but what I encountered there was something beyond my understanding, he wrote in his private journal, later found after his death. The land, it was hungry. I prayed over the bodies, but the air was thick with something foul. It was as if something was watching, something waiting for me to leave, and I swear, it whispered my name. Father Harper's encounter seemed to confirm the suspicions of many, including Eleanor Carter, who had long since lost faith in the idea of what she had seen, what she had witnessed, was beyond rational thought. She could not explain it, nor could anyone else, but the truth was slowly becoming clear. The land had taken them, not by accident, but by design. There was no denying it. As more witnesses came forward with their chilling accounts, a picture began to emerge. a picture of unexplainable horrors, of ancient forces long buried, waiting for the right moment to rise and claim what was theirs. And for the settlers of Robertson's land, that moment had come. Their price had been paid, and the cost was more than just land. It was their soul. And so the story of the 74 settlers who paid the price for trusting Jedediah Robertson's promises remains one of the darkest chapters of the American frontier. The land that was meant to be a place of hope and prosperity instead became a tomb, claiming the lives of those who sought to build a new future. Amen. Was it a curse that haunted the land? A supernatural force that had been awakened by the settlers' arrival, or was it something far more human? The reckless ambition of a man who sought to control something he could never fully understand. Perhaps it was a combination of both, an intertwining of ambition, greed, and ancient forces long buried beneath the earth. The Robertsons' land may have been abandoned, but its legacy remains. The whispers of those 74 souls lost to the earth echo through time, their names long forgotten, their deaths still unexplained. Some say that the land still holds its secrets, that it waits for the next foolhardy soul to dare uncover them, and yet, no one can say for certain if the curse has ever been broken, or if it still lingers, silent, just beyond the horizon. The tale of the Robertsons is not one easily forgotten, but perhaps it is better that way. History has a tendency to bury the truths we are unwilling to face, to shroud them in myths and legends, where they are left to rot in the darkness of time. The truth about what happened on that land may never be fully understood, but the lessons it teaches us about human folly, trust, and the unknown forces that lie hidden in the world around us should never be dismissed. As we close the chapter on this story, we invite you to join the conversation. Do you think the Robertsons were the victims of a curse? Or was it something far more earthly: greed, madness, and an endless thirst for control? Could the land itself have a will, a hunger that claims those foolish enough to believe in its promises? Or were these simply the tragic consequences of an unfulfilled dream? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think happened to the settlers of the Robertsons' land? Do you have any theories about the cause of their mysterious deaths? Share your thoughts with us, and let's continue to unravel this haunting tale together. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. We dive deep into the darkest corners of history, unearthing tales of mystery, horror, and the unsolved. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and as always, watch the shadows. They may hold secrets you're not meant to find.